Berlin, 1943. A man sits across from a senior SS officer, sharing a bottle of schnapps, laughing at his jokes, nodding along to his ideology. He looks like every other German at that table. He speaks like them. He dresses like them. But underneath his perfectly pressed jacket, he is memorizing every word spoken, every name mentioned, every secret carelessly revealed by men drunk on power and alcohol. His name is not what they think it is. His God is not their God. And if they ever find out the truth, he will be dead before sunrise. This is not fiction. This happened. And it happened dozens of times in dozens of cities, carried out by a network so secret that even its own members did not know each other's real names. In the darkest years of the Second World War, a group of Jewish men and women made a choice that defied every instinct of survival. They did not flee. They did not hide. They walked directly into the belly of the beast. They became the Sonderkommando of intelligence, not the enslaved prisoners inside the camps, but something far more dangerous. Spies, operating in plain sight, inside Nazi Germany itself. Their story was buried for decades. Classified, hushed. Survivors who lived to tell it often didn't. And the ones who did were rarely believed, because the truth was simply too extraordinary. The network had a name that most history books still ignore. It was called the Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle, and within its threads ran a current that even the Gestapo, even the SS, even Hitler's most feared intelligence apparatus took years to unravel. And by the time they did, the damage was irreversible. To understand how this network was born, you have to understand what Germany looked like in the early 1930s. Before the killing, before the camps, before the world knew what was coming, Jewish families had lived in Germany for centuries. They were doctors, lawyers, professors, musicians, scientists. They were German. They believed in Germany. And so when the Nazi Party rose, many of them did not run. They waited. They told themselves it would pass. They were wrong. By 1933, Jews were being stripped of citizenship. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws made them legally subhuman. By 1938, Kristallnacht turned broken glass into a prelude to genocide. And yet some stayed. Some stayed not out of denial, but out of defiance. And a handful of them, brilliant, desperate, and furious, decided that if they were going to die anyway, they would make their deaths mean something. One of those people was Harro Schulze-Boysen. He was not Jewish. He was the grandson of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, a Luftwaffe officer, and a man who looked, by every measure, like the perfect Nazi. Blonde, Aryan, decorated, trusted. He was given access to secret communications inside the Reich Air Ministry, and he used every single piece of that access to feed intelligence to the Soviets and to the underground resistance. He did it not for money. He did it because he had watched what Nazism actually was, and he chose the opposite. Around him gathered a constellation of conspirators. Arvid Harnack, an economist and Harvard-educated legal scholar who worked inside the Reich Economics Ministry. His wife Mildred, an American literature professor who had married into Germany and refused to leave its underground. John Graudenz, a former foreign correspondent. And woven throughout this network, Jewish men and women who had gone underground, obtained forged papers, assumed false identities, and continued to live, move, and spy inside a country that had declared their extermination. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to comprehend. These Jewish operatives could not simply blend in. Every day was a calculation. Your accent, your nose, the way you answer a question too slowly, the prayer you whispered before eating that you had to swallow back before anyone heard it. One moment of instinct, one flicker of the wrong emotion on your face. That was all it took. The Gestapo did not need evidence. They needed suspicion, and yet they operated for years. One of the most remarkable figures in this network was a woman known only by her code name for most of the post-war period, later identified as Liane Berkowitz. She was 19 years old, half Jewish, a dancer. She distributed anti-Nazi leaflets across Berlin while the city was under full SS control. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the penalty. She was eventually caught, tried by the Nazi People's Court, and sentenced to death. She was pregnant when they guillotined her. She was 20 years old. Let that sit with you for a moment. The intelligence these operatives gathered was not trivial. This is the part that most documentaries skip past too quickly, the actual stakes of what they were doing. In 1941, before Operation Barbarossa, members of the network sent warnings to Moscow that Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union. Stalin, paralyzed by his own paranoia about German disinformation, largely ignored it. But the warnings were real. They were accurate, and they came from people who had risked everything to send them. Later, after the invasion, the network provided the Soviets with detailed information about German troop movements, logistics, and Luftwaffe operations. In the mathematics of war, where a single piece of accurate intelligence can shift the outcome of battle. This information had consequences that ran through the entire Eastern Front. But then came the moment that unraveled everything. In the summer of 1941, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, began intercepting coded Soviet radio transmissions. They could not break the codes immediately, but they were patient. By 1942, German codebreakers began cracking the messages, and what they found sent shockwaves through the entire Nazi intelligence apparatus. There were spies everywhere, inside the ministries, inside the military, inside the very offices where Germany was planning its war. The Gestapo launched a manhunt unlike any they had conducted before. It was called the Sonderkommission Rotkapelle, the Special Commission for the Red Orchestra. They worked with cold, methodical fury, and one by one, the threads of the network began to pull apart. Harro Schulze-Boysen was arrested in August 1942, Arvid Harnack days later, Mildred Harnack shortly after. The trials were not trials. They were theater. The verdicts were written before the defendants entered the room. Harro was executed by hanging at Plötzensee prison in December 1942. Arvid was executed the same night. Mildred Harnack was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but Hitler personally reviewed the sentence and demanded her death. She was guillotined on February 16, 1943, reportedly reciting a line from Goethe as the blade fell. She was the only American woman executed by the Third Reich. Over the following months, more than 130 members of the network were arrested. Dozens were executed. Others died in the prisons. Some survived. A small number vanished so completely that no one could prove they had ever existed. And here's where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Because while the Gestapo believed they had destroyed the Red Orchestra, they had not. Not entirely. Fragments of the network survived. New cells formed from the ashes. The instinct to resist, in people who had nothing left to lose, does not die easily. Some Jewish operatives who had been connected to the outer edges of the network went deeper underground. They obtained new identities, new papers. They became, in the language of those who helped them, U-boats, submarines, people who had submerged beneath the surface of Nazi society and were invisible, hiding in plain sight, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Hamburg, in cities where their names were on lists and their faces were on files. The number of Jewish people who survived the entire war in hiding inside Germany is estimated at around 1,700. Out of hundreds of thousands who had once called Germany home. Many of those who survived did so because of networks of extraordinary courage, both Jewish and non-Jewish Germans who risked death to shelter them, feed them, forge their documents, and keep their secrets. What does it mean to live as a ghost inside a machine built to destroy you? It means you learn to suppress every natural human reflex. You cannot cry at the right moments. You cannot laugh at the wrong ones. You walk into churches and mouth the words. You raise your arm at the rallies. You toast the Führer's health. And you hold, somewhere in the locked room of yourself, everything that you actually are, everything that you actually believe, like a small flame cupped in your hands. Waiting, always waiting for the wind to stop. There's a particular cruelty to this kind of survival. The survivors of the camps carried visible wounds that the world could eventually see and name. The survivors of the underground carried wounds with no name at all. the psychological architecture required to live a complete double life, for years under sentence of death, left marks that most of them could never fully describe. After the war, the story of the Red Orchestra became deeply complicated by politics. The Soviets lionized the network as communist heroes, which many, though not all, of them were. The West, now in the early Cold War, was uncomfortable elevating people who had spied for Stalin. The German government was slow to acknowledge resistors of any kind. And so the Jewish spies who had operated inside the Reich fell into a kind of historical limbo, too complicated for any side to claim cleanly. It took decades before streets were named after them, decades before memorials were built, decades before their files were fully declassified and researchers could begin to piece together the full picture. And even now, even today, there are names we do not know. Operatives whose identities were protected so well, whose cover held so completely that they took their true names to the grave. Somewhere in Germany, there are people living ordinary lives who are descended from someone who walked into the SS and smiled and never cracked. And no one knows. That is the final thing to understand about the Jewish spies who operated inside Nazi Germany. They were not superheroes. They were not cold, detached agents from the pages of a thriller. They were teachers, students, artists, lovers. They were people who understood with absolute clarity that history was a door, and that on the other side of it was either a world that remembered what humanity was capable of, or one that forgot. They chose to hold the door open, with their forged papers, their borrowed names, their swallowed prayers, their bodies placed between the machine and the world. History remembers the camps. History remembers the battles. But the people who walked willingly into the darkness, unarmed except with courage and deception, they're still there, waiting to be found, in the files and the fragments, in the silence between the words of every document the Reich thought it had buried forever. They were never meant to survive. Most of them didn't, but they were there, and they did not go quietly into the night that was designed for them. They lit fires inside it instead.